So I'm Peter Freilich. I'm the Director of the Press, Director of Scholarly Publishing, Head of Scholarly Publishing Services. And I'm here to introduce our afternoon activity and the afternoon speaker. Am I hard to hear? I wasn't certain. So sometimes I'm loud. I'm too loud. So there we are. Can you hear me now? Here we go. All right, so I'll be introducing Barbara Kline and the activities that we have this afternoon. First, Barbara is going to speak, and she's developed this talk specifically for us this afternoon on communications, and so you'll be very interested, I think, by what she has to say. And then afterwards, we will have the activities that you're all now prepared in separate teams to participate in, what I should point to first in Barbara's title are two things, that she has two areas of expertise. So if you see, she's the Executive Director for Communications, with an S, and the National Academies Press. So she has backgrounds, about 10 or plus years professional background and experience in communications, in addition to many more years experience in publishing, working with the press. She'll be leveraging both of these areas of knowledge and expertise in her work and her research. She's also a published scholar in her own right. And she'll be leveraging both for us this afternoon as she speaks. And one of the most important things that we have to remember about communications with an S, as we all know, communications is not just about access, but it's about access, raising awareness is a higher level, raising awareness and understanding, yet a higher one still, raising public or shaping public opinion, public action, and behavior higher still. And that's the highest bar to which we will be reaching this afternoon. And with that, I'd like to introduce Barbara Kline Pope.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to all of you who made my morning very interesting. I read all of the synopses of your research, but hearing about them and hearing about the interdisciplinary aspects of them was really rewarding for me, so thank you very much. So I am here today to talk about communications. And many of us believe that we know all about communications because we communicate every day in our personal lives. But the divorce rate will tell you that we don't always do a great job of it. So we're not going to talk about our personal lives today. We're going to talk about interdisciplinary research. And what I want to do today is try to make sure that we are using best practices in the science of science communication in order for you to make the most out of your research projects. And so by the time we're done with my talk, I think you'll have just a sense of the science of science communication, that there is a scholarly base for communicating science and communicating science across all of the science, including the behavioral and social sciences. Then I'll get down to practicalities, and I want to talk a little bit about impact and what kinds and ranges of impacts that we look for at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And then talk about dissemination and how we use dissemination as we're looking at audiences, looking at messages, how we're using that dissemination to enable some of those impacts. And I don't say to drive the impacts, but sometimes you can drive impacts. Sometimes you need to just sort of enable them. So before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm not a scientist, but I've been so happy to be surrounded by scientists really for the entire 30 years that I've worked at the academies, and that's really been my entire career. So I'm married to a scientist, and by day I run communications and publishing for the National Academies. In fact, I should just say here that we just changed our name. We used to be the National Academies, and now we're the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and it would take me the rest of the afternoon to tell you why and how that happened, because I'm also in charge of branding. But I'm a true fan of all of the sciences, and we do span all of the sciences at the academies. But I'm very, very fond of the social and behavioral sciences. And I think that's because I've done some research. As I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher, but I have done some research over the years, both to get my MS as well as to do some work at the academies that fall into applied social science. So I've done communication research, kind of audience research, messaging research. I've done research in the area of consumer behavior. I did that for my MS. And then I've also done some research in the publishing world where we did a live online experiment to determine what price we should be charging for electronic content back in 2002, a long time ago, when we were thinking about that. So let me just introduce you quickly to where I work. So the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine started out as the National Academy of Sciences in 1863. And we were founded by Abraham Lincoln right in the middle as he was prosecuting the Civil War. So he had a lot on his mind, but he was also thinking about science. And he started the National Academy of Sciences so that he would have an objective, authoritative group of experts to advise him in the areas of science. And today we're called the National Academies of Science and Engineering Medicine. We've gotten bigger, we've gotten broader, and we're really seen as the highest authorities in those areas. And every year, we have about 7,000 volunteers who examine some of the most pressing issues of the day. So, and sometimes they're controversial. So these are some of our reports. And as you can see, we are doing very important work in evolution, very controversial, doing important work in climate change, also controversial, genetically modified organisms, also controversial. And so the kinds of work that we do means that we need to be able to communicate incredibly well. And it's not always an easy task to be able to communicate this. And my role is to take the work of those 7,000 volunteers who develop these studies, and did about 200 studies a year, to publish those and to communicating the messages as widely as possible. And as I said, it is difficult to communicate controversial issues. But thanks to the behavioral and social sciences, we have some understanding about why people decide to deny climate change or to not accept evolution that we can use in making our communication more effective. And we can use that understanding to our advantage. And so I want to start with a story of, these are the members of the Council of the National Academy of Sciences. And these eminent members, back in 2010, we were in many meetings and they were getting very discouraged and very frustrated by the public's lack of acceptance of the scientific consensus on those kinds of areas that are very difficult to communicate about, on climate change and those other kinds of topics. And so when I was in those meetings with them, as their frustration was mounting, I would hear, no one is listening to the facts, no one is accepting what we're telling them, and no one trusts scientists and no one trusts science. And so I started to think, wow, this is like the Rodney Dangerfield, aspect of science, that we think nobody's listening to us, no one's respecting us. And so I went out and I, as communications person for the NAS and the rest of the institution, I started to look at some poll numbers. And so for one of the meetings, I brought back some of these poll numbers and I said, well, it's unusual that you would be thinking this because the polls show that there is great trust and confidence in science and scientists. And in fact, many people out there in the world are very enthusiastic about even funding research in the sciences. So I'll share with you some of these stats. This is from the Science and Engineering Indicators of 2014. And you can see that public confidence in science is very high, just under the military. And so the blue and the red are a great deal of confidence and some confidence. So I said, well, look, there's 70% over many, many years, over decades, there's very high confidence. This next one shows the public acceptance of science as being beneficial, more beneficial than risks. And so people believe that, yes, there are some risks to science, but they believe that the benefits, most people, I think this is again 70%, people believe that the benefits of science far outweigh any risks. So here's another positive thing about public acceptance of science. Scientists also have a very high level of prestige. This is one of my favorite data points. The Harris Poll was collecting this for years and years, and now they've stopped. So the last time that these data were collected was 2009. But I've ordered their data in order of 2009 and the ranking of very great prestige of occupations. And so this gets a little messy, so I'm just going to click through a couple of them. So the first one is firefighters came into the survey after 9/11. So they have very, very great prestige. And then scientists are next. So if the public is holding science into this very great prestige, why are the most eminent members of the scientific community, who are councils of the National Academy of Sciences, thinking that they're not being respected? And then very quickly, I'm just going to, doctors and there we are, nurses. And then I'm just going to click down through this. It gets really messy, as you can imagine. But just to show you how many other occupations are below science. There are a lot of occupations that are less respected than science. Also, this last chart that I showed them was that the public opinion on the federal government should be funding scientific research. And I guess I'm surrounded by scientists every day, and I constantly hear that, people think that we shouldn't be funding research, we're getting research money taken away, and that is true in some cases. But this was information that I thought that I should show. But then, of course, they asked, okay, given these poll results, then why are people denying that climate change exists and that it's human caused? Why aren't people accepting evolution? And why aren't people believing that genetically modified organisms are widely safe? What's the problem? So the next time I walked into the council's meeting, I plopped down on a table a big pile of research papers by scholars in the world of science, of the emerging area of science communication. And I said, help is right under our noses. You just need to go to your colleagues in the behavioral and social sciences, and they can provide some answers for us. They can provide research. They can help us understand the cognitive underpinnings of people's perceptions about science, and also the political and social landscape into which our messages are heading. If we can better understand that, we might do a better job of being able to communicate science out to the public. So over the course of a year or so, we invited a number of social scientists to address the council. In addition, one of these persons is a practitioner. This is Corey Dean from the New York Times. So we introduced practitioners as well to these scientists. And we did this for a number of reasons. Of course, it was an eye toward reducing our own frustration, but it was also to make our own communication more effective. And what we ended up, after we listened and learned from the behavioral and social scientists about these issues, is that scientists tend to, that accepting the scientific consensus is less about the facts and more about people's values. And that's one of the things that was incredibly important. Because, no one refutes thermodynamics or gravity. And so the thing about climate change and GMOs and these other sticky issues is that people's values, people's ways of life, their attitudes and the belief actually interfere with the messages that we're trying to get across to them. So it's not just about filling people's heads with these topics. And so our brains are not these empty vessels waiting for we scientists and engineers to be putting facts into their brains. It's not like that at all. In fact, it's more like this swamp. And so we need to know what's lurking in that swamp that's chewing up our messages, so our messages are not getting through. We also need to know what's in that swamp that might actually be warping those messages and making them more exact with their particular values, to kind of warping into those values. So after hearing from all these people, a couple of the members of the council decided that it would be great to get these stakeholders, 3 stakeholders, into a colloquia series on the science of communication. So it's not just the council learning, but the whole scientific community learning about the science of communication. And those 3 stakeholders are those scholars in the world of science communication who can teach us about their research. The second one is content experts in any area of the science or engineering who have content that they want to share. And the third stakeholder group are practitioners like me. And if we can all get together and learn from each other and do a better job of using the research in science communication to do a better job of communicating, that would be a great idea. And so they hatched this idea to have these colloquia series, and I was lucky enough to be the lead staff person in this, so I learned a lot as well. Got to interact with a lot of people in science communication. I'm going to play a 1-minute video that I think works better to explain to you why this colloquia series was important. It'd be easier than me just saying it.
We observe, we measure, we analyze, we replicate. Yet, when it comes to communicating the meaning and significance of our discoveries, why do we so often use our intuition instead of science? The stakes are too high to rely on our hunches. Just think of all the critical topics in science that suffer from ineffective communication. It doesn't have to be this way. Social, behavioral, and decision scientists have made great progress in understanding how communication fails and succeeds. We should be as scientific about communication as about the science we are communicating. The Sackler Colloquia on the Science of Science Communication, where scientists and communication professionals come together to write a better future for communicating science.
So we had 2 of these, one in 2010 and one in 2012, 2011, 2013 actually. All of the videos are online for you to look at. That would take you hours. And so today I just want to give you some 5 main takeaways from this. Also, these are published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, so you can go there and read it if you'd rather do that than watch videos. But the 5 main takeaways are that the first one, the very most important one I've heard from many speakers, is that people are not idiots. And so you don't want to insult your audience as scientists or engineers when you stand up to speak. Susan Fisk, who's a psychologist at Princeton, implored us at the very first talk in the second colloquium not to insult our audiences, because it's a well-known fact in psychology that when you do that, people see you as not part of their in-group, and they shut down, and they're not going to listen to anything that you say. Later that day, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who's head of the Annenberg School for Public Policy at Penn, was talking about a number of different sticky communications issues. And she said, conservatives are not stupid about climate change, and liberals are not stupid about genetically modified organisms. So don't do this. The second is that credibility is bestowed by the audience, not by the speaker, not by the scientists. And credibility really consists of 2 things, and this came out from Susan Fisk's talk as well. One is expertise, and so you have to be competent. And scientists and engineers are very good at projecting expertise. The second is trust. And trust is really the motivation to be truthful. And once you break that motivation to be truthful, that can be toxic to communication. And this happens when scientists and engineers who are talking about their work and their expertise, and then they go into advocacy. And so you have to be really careful about not advocating for something for which there is no evidence base. So that was one of the main takeaways that I took from that. Also, that we need to listen to our audiences. We know from that swamp that we need to figure out what's in that swamp. We need to know what our audiences need to know rather than what we think they need to know. And so doing that kind of work, and we can think about this afternoon when we're talking about these 5 different projects, you really need to be thinking about who those audiences are, what's relevant to them, what's going to make their lives better, and what do you have to share with them that is going to help them rather than help you as a communicator. Fourth, we talked about this, that facts aren't always relevant, particularly when we're talking about a scientific consensus on a controversial issue. And we need to realize that we're not just filling those empty vessels. And the last one, you know, the whole field in the science of science communication that looks at the political environment, the social environment, the cultural environment in which our messages either go through or come up against. And there are many, colloquium, there are many people who study this area, and so I suggest that if you're interested in this, that you go on and look at that as well. So, as I said, there were 2 of these colloquia, and the first one had some connections to the second one. And so I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about one piece of research from the first one that led to a piece of research on the second one. And so the first one was from Dan Kahan, and he's a professor of psychology and law at Yale. And he was trying to answer one question, and that was, why do members of the public disagree on facts on which the scientists largely agree? So why is this the case? And after careful research, I'll talk a little bit more about his methods later, but after careful research, he came up with that people form perceptions based on their values. And it's just sort of, that's just the way it is. And so you can get 2 different people reading the exact same description of a scientific consensus, and they come up with different ideas based on that description, based on their values. And this is a little controversial how he calls this the cognitive, cultural cognition of expert consensus. That's just his label for his research. Interesting research, actually. And he divides them into hierarchical individualists and egalitarian communitarians. And a lot of people look at that and say, okay, that's liberals and conservatives. He says that's not really the case. Maybe I have that value in my head, I'm not really convinced. But the work that was done after that did use that rubric as liberals and conservatives, so I think it can work. And he also found that people systematically overestimate the degree of scientific consensus around the positions that they're culturally predisposed to accept. And so he gave this presentation to our council. He gave the presentation at the Sackler Colloquia Series, and we all said to him as practitioners, okay, so well, what can we do about that? And he said, well, this is empirical research, and this is just telling you that endpoint bias, that's basically what this is on endpoint bias, actually exists, and we need to do more research. So I thought, wow, well, I need something before that. I've got these issues to deal with. But Kathleen Hull-Jameson comes to the rescue. She told me numerous times that she was so glad that Dan Kahan was able to show empirically that endpoint bias happened during a scientific consensus. So when we're taking that endpoint bias psychology piece and putting it right into scientific consensus, that meant that she could do some research to try to figure out how to overcome that endpoint bias. And she did do that research. And rather than keep turning around, I'm going to do this from here. So in her research, she figured out how scientists can minimize the likelihood that the audience, that their endpoint bias would lead to rejection of a message. So she says this, interestingly, in a negative way, because this is not the be-all and end-all, but it can reduce the likelihood that people will reject your message because of their endpoint bias. So there's seven things, she said, that people, scientists, can do. And the first one is to stay away from advocacy. So in the empirical research she was doing, she showed that if you move into advocacy, you're going to get rejection of your message I can't remember the percentage of time. That scientists and engineers need to show that the conclusions that they've come to through the scientific method. And what we're not saying is that the scientific method, that you have to go through each individual piece of your methodology, but you do need to show that you've empirically come to your conclusions. Again here, that you're respectful of your audience's intelligence, and that you rely on sources that are relatively well regarded by both conservatives and liberals. And that the message explains how the scientist is offering that conclusion. In the particular research that she did, was on sea level rise, and she was able to have an interactive chart that it was a visual that the audience could actually see what was happening, and so they really felt like they were coming to their own conclusion. And she found that was incredibly effective. And last, in her research, she used an analogy for sea level rise, and she found that was also very useful. And I will say, I'm doing some audience research right now that shows that metaphors and analogy empirically work incredibly well to get these kinds of issues across. So as you might expect, at this point, our institution has enthusiastically embraced the social science of science communication, and we are using it in our own work. And so with this as a backdrop, what I want to do now is kind of move into the practical side of things and to show you how the kinds of impacts that we look for and how we're using dissemination and tools to drive those impacts through the work that we do. And so, as we said before, we publish about 200 studies a year. Those studies are turned into books. And so I'm going to talk to you about from the information in those books, how we disseminate that, not necessarily just the book, and then how that drives impact. So first I just want to say that what really energizes me to work hard, and I've spent my entire career helping scientists around the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine get their messages out. And what really drives me is the fact that I know that our organization is making an impact on people's lives around the world. So just very quickly, a couple of impacts that haven't happened recently, but that have happened in the past, is that early on, our institution recommended that the government start the National Park Service. So I can't say that it was only our recommendation that got them started on that, but we have the national parks because of the National Academies. We also authored 10 editions of the recommended dietary allowances for healthy people, so we're leaders in the area of nutrition. We helped NASA figure out how to save the Hubble Space Telescope. We have provided the evidence in the 80s for secondhand smoke being toxic, and that made the airlines decide to ban smoking. So the fact that you get to be on a plane without smoke, you can thank our scientists at the academies. And we have set the standards for what kids should learn in science and engineering in our nation's schools. Recently, we provided the evidence to the National Institutes of Health that chimpanzees are no longer needed for many disease models, and they're only needed for one disease model. And NIH has now been retiring those chimps. So this is what our work, your work, the research that we all do, this is why it's important. We want to make an impact. We want to make a difference in people's lives. So for this meeting, I decided to, and we haven't done this before, but to categorize our impacts, because I thought it'd be easier for me to talk about it that way. I'm going to present this to our governing board next week, and because they know us so well, they'll start to pick at this typology. But I think that for our use today, when we're thinking about what are the impacts that you want to have from your research, I think this is a good way to talk about it. So for legislation and regulation, we want to have a broad impact on federal regulators, on federal policymakers. And so one of these reports, also on legislation, and so one of these reports, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which in my world is a pretty famous. Has anybody heard of this study? Yay, okay, the most famous report that we have 4 people. But this was the basis for the America Competes Act. So this is really telling Congress asked us for this study. So we were telling Congress what are the 20 top things we can do to energize our economy and to energize our nation. And it was used in that legislation. We also do things, the second one here, on automotive fuel economy. So it's just an example of the kinds of things that we do that affect federal regulation. So many of our studies have an effect on government policy, and in particularly on government programs. My favorite one here, again, is the one I've already mentioned, the chimps. And in fact, the scientist I'm married to, that's his study. So I always feature that. Another really important study that we do every 10 years is a survey of what the funding priorities should be for astronomy and astrophysics, and that's this New Worlds, New Horizons. And so NASA, NSF, and DOE await every decade the survey that includes so many astrophysicists around the world to determine what kind of funding priorities we should have in this country. And so that definitely has a big impact on government policies and government programs. So forensic science in the United States is a report that had an effect on the community of forensic science like you wouldn't believe. I mean, it's really transformed that entire field. But impacts can also take the form of influencing an individual. And so when we think about impacts, you really can't think too small about impacts, because even if you have a small impact, it can turn out to be a much bigger impact as well. And so individuals, in turn, can make better decisions in their lives. They can make better decisions in the voting booth. They could decide to delve into a topic and increase their own knowledge and move more broadly into that topic as well. And so when you can affect a lot of individuals and a lot of individuals' own personal knowledge, that's certainly a worthwhile impact. And the one I want to highlight here is how people learn. And how people learn has been the required textbook. We didn't do this as a textbook, but this is a textbook that has been either purchased or freely downloaded by hundreds of thousands of students in classrooms nationwide. We've had similar kinds of, not quite the numbers on the dietary reference intakes. The dietary reference intakes is the new incarnation of the recommended dietary allowances. So over many years, we've been working in that area. I happen to work on science, evolution, and creationism. I did the upfront audience research on that, and that's gotten out to many school districts, school boards. It's a project I'm quite proud of. And while it's infrequent that our studies really rise to the level of changing culture and changing broad society, when they do, it's really significant. So on this slide, we have all of our work in the National Science Education Standards, which started in 1996. We did the framework for K through 12, which then fed into the next edition of the National Science Education Standards, which is called the Next Generation Science Standards. And so we are really, as I said before, deciding through the community. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of teachers involved. They have input to this, of what our kids should be learning in science and engineering. The first study on the publishing side of my world, we sold 500,000 copies. That was also free to download. I don't even remember how many downloads. It was more than 500,000 of that. Next Generation Science Standards, the same way. And framework, we've had already on that report 150,000 downloads, free downloads. So now I want to talk a little bit about dissemination and what we do in dissemination at the academies. But I first want to talk about the relationship between dissemination and impact. And there's just not always a straight line. And in fact, when I was thinking about this, for this talk that I'm giving, I started to think that every now and then there's a mother-daughter relationship between dissemination and impact, but that's not very often. Typically, it's distant cousins, or it can even be an inverse relationship, or maybe, it's just friends. So we're going to talk about chimps again. So you're going to remember this. This is the third time you've heard about it. This is where we did only our baseline dissemination. But I told you before about the great impact of this. And so what happened with this report is that actually Congress asked NIH to answer this question. NIH didn't want to answer this question, so they gave it to my husband's board on health sciences policy to answer this question. So they were waiting for it. They were waiting to find out what the answer was for this, and so was Congress. So there really was no reason to put a lot of money into disseminating this report. But we gave it the baseline dissemination. I'll just tell you real quickly what that is. So it got a press release. It got briefed on the Hill. Based on that press release, we got a lot of coverage. It wasn't like we were pushing it. We didn't spend a lot of money for it, but who doesn't love chimpanzees? So it was all over the newspapers. We also put all of our reports, all of our books, up online for free to read. And we've been doing that since 1994. We've been doing it in PDF since between 2004 and 2011. And we get about 2 million downloads of all of our reports every year, which is far more than the 80,000 books that we sell in print. So every report gets that. This also got an e-blast. And so because we have so much content on our website, we have 200,000 people on a mailing list who want to know more from us. And so this went out to the group of people who really wanted that information as well. But we didn't buy any advertising. We didn't go out of our way to disseminate this, but we got the impact we wanted. And so sometimes, we in our scientific community are thinking, okay, so is there a positive correlation between the amount of dissemination and the level of impact? And what I say is probably, sometimes, but not here. We got great impact. We did not have a lot of dissemination. So there's not really a science to this. I would love to actually do an evaluation of the relationship, but right now we're really working on 30 years of experience doing this, knowing what these studies, the potential audiences for these studies are. So now I want to talk about two other reports. The first one is on incarceration and the more extensive dissemination that we've done for these two. So when you have an audience who wants the message, they don't necessarily want to read a 200-page or a 400-page book. And so while there are researchers in this area who would love to have this, those people who are interested in this outside the research area don't necessarily want to read a whole book. So in the last 10 years, we've been building lots of derivative products or dissemination products from these books. And I've been lucky enough that my publishing background and my marketing communication background has come together, so I've been able to oversee a lot of this. So for this one, there were so many data points in this incarceration report that we did an infographic. And so it was a one-page infographic, but it hews directly to that report. Because we're seen as the authorities in these areas, we have to make sure that everything that we say in any dissemination product is exactly correct and hews to the report. This, we didn't just put this on our website and we didn't just hand it out in print. We got partners around different communities who care about this issue to post it on their websites. And so in that way, we can leverage our partnerships to get out to more people. We always do a report brief, a little 2 or 4 pager on every 200 or 400 page report that we do. I think for this one, they did one on in Spanish as well. And then, because some people care only about certain issues in incarceration, the committee that did this report decided to create issue briefs on specific topics. They did 2 videos. This got mentioned in the New York Review of Books. And then there was a big social media campaign on this. And in fact, when you hear the presidential candidates talking about rates of incarceration, most of that data is coming from our report. And we'll talk a little later about evaluation and how we know how well we're reaching our audiences. But this shows the blue part of this altmetric is the tweets. That's the Twitter. This is a pretty high altmetric scale. I think we were the first book publisher by about 20 minutes. I think the University of Michigan Press put altmetrics on their books for 20 minutes after we did, but so I can still say we were first. Because it's usually altmetric is used in journals. So this is another set of reports that we produced on climate intervention. And many of you may know this as geoengineering. But this study committee decided that climate intervention is a better name for what we all know as geoengineering. So we didn't do as many derivative products on this. We didn't feel that the audience was as broad as incarceration. But we did do a website on for these two books and also for all of our books on climate change. This is also interesting in that when you aggregate content together, you can sometimes get many more people who don't know they want these new books because they're coming for other things. And we know that from libraries as well, right? Aggregation. We did briefing slides and a webcast of the public event. And then we tried something new, and maybe some of you have tried this before, but we put our committee members on Reddit and did an Ask Me Anything, so it's an AMA. And so they have a great ability to get people on the site to talk about issues, and controversial issues or just issues of interest in science. And so our committee members for a couple of hours were online with people who were asking questions about geoengineering and climate intervention. So how do we know how we're doing as far as dissemination goes and impact? It's been something we've been talking about, I think, on the first day of 30 years ago when I got to the academies. And as I said, there's no science to it. But all of us around our institution, the publishing division, our library, and the program groups who are actually creating this content work together to figure out how we're doing in dissemination. And we've been pretty good at writing down what we've done. So, how many people did we reach out to, both on the web, how many media hits have we had. So we do these 6-month summaries on some of our reports that can tell us how we're doing. We also do media hits, PDF downloads, the number of pages that people come online and read. And as I said, we are using altmetrics now to try to determine the kind of news coverage that we have, Wikipedia, Facebook, blogs, and other places. And the big sticky issue here is what are the impacts and how can we make sure that we're tracking not just the outputs, how many people come and download and read, and hopefully they're reading if they download, but what actually were the impacts. And in this is the area where the library actually came to us and said there's a lot of information that we can pull down on citations and other information that we can provide to you. And so we use publishing metrics, we use the library's metrics, and then the program staff who are really watching legislation, and they're watching how people are picking up on this, get put into these impacts. But again, it's more of an art than a science. And so to sum up, I think I can just say that communicating the fruits of our research, of your research, is really essential to making a difference in our country and in the world. And I've been spending my entire life doing that, and I hope that this afternoon, all of us together can work to figure out how we might help make bigger impacts or even more focused impacts for the research projects that you're working on. Thank you. I think we do. We want to have as much time as possible for you to interact together because I think that's more important. But if you think we have time, sure.
accuracy. So we know the universal gravitational constant or the dielectric constant of vacuum with very great accuracy, because any model, as I was saying before, is model plus noise. Whereas if you look at climate models and so on, there is a great deal of noise. So if you look at the UN climate report, it says, the sea level is going to rise anywhere between 2 inches and 2 meters over the next 100 years. So the question is, when people are asked to pay $1,000 extra in electricity bills every year, it's obviously going to make them emotional. And the other side of it is when you impoverish people in some fashion like that, they are going to be much more nasty. Because when people's stomachs are filled, say in the United States as compared to India, they're much more nice to each other. Whereas when their stomachs are not so full, they're not going to be so nice to each other. And the other side of it was when you're, say, presenting evolution, there are many, many pathways in evolution which have scarcely, been investigated properly. For example, all the horizontal transfer of genes and so on and so forth, and feedback mechanisms. So that is why it is possible for somebody to easily beat up the arguments for evolution. I mean, evolution is happening, change is happening, and inside our bodies it happens very quickly at the cellular level. But you have to, focus on what is immediately conveyable by the facts. For example, the evolution of bacteria, or things of that sort, rather than, to show all these macro examples for which it is much more difficult to prove make the case in there.
When we're
Because there
talking
is so
about
much of
evolution, I
uncertainty.
agree with that, and I was very involved in that study. And we did talk about medicine and evolution as far as vaccines and other work goes, and that was actually much more relevant. The other thing in that book that we really heeded our own research, in the social sciences, not to insult your audience, in that we said, religion and science is really a different way of knowing, but that scientists do know that evolution is occurring. And so we even had quotes from religious leaders in that book saying that, if you're Catholic, know that you can accept evolution. So we were very respectful of our audiences and also used examples that tested well. We actually did audience testing on that.
Over this way. First of all, thank you. This was great. At one point, you talk about not being perceived as advocating when you're communicating your science. And I think for me, the challenge is, in some settings, just to say the fact is perceived as advocating. So, if I say climate change is certainly being shaped by human activity, and here's evidence, that can be heard as advocating a position. Did during the colloquia you talk about did you get at that underlying challenge of not advocating?
We didn't completely get at that, and I understand that. And of course, that's seen as advocating because that is one of those issues that is influenced by your values. If you're saying those same exact facts about gravity, nobody is going to say that you're advocating for gravity. So it is an area where you need to be extra careful. But I always say advocating for good science is okay. Just advocating for a position that is more of a decision that a policymaker or a community group should be making is something that scientists should try to stay away from.
A number of years ago, is this on? Can you hear? Yeah. A number of years ago, Purdue implemented a program called the Science Laureates. And it was to bring writers who interpret the findings of science for the layman. And it was through various newspapers, journals, this type of thing. But it was not people who were writing research findings, but it was people interpreting it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that came out of it was how the findings, which are highlighted in the media, and this is beyond what they were writing about. They were talking about the popular media. Because I was on the panel and I said, as an example, you could read that in the New England Journal of Medicine, that scientists had found one indicator that might be related to the development of cancer within the colon or something like this. But it was very specific in the New England Journal of Medicine. Then the next discussion was scientists have found a link to solving the issue of colon cancer. And then it would be dumbed down again into the fact that they had found a cure for colon cancer, each time not understanding the complexity of the scientific method, in that every single thing that is a very small piece of a larger picture is only just one small piece. That the local media or the popular media tend to jump on this. And so consequently, the comment was, it's more or less claiming things too often to the population, that we've found the cure to cancer, when actually that wasn't what they were saying.
right.
But that's the way it was interpreted. And so after a person hears this 5, 6, 7 times, and then it never materializes, they lose faith in science.
That's exactly right.
Do you think that that's accurate?
Yeah, I do think it's accurate, and I have some data for that. It's difficult to communicate uncertainty, and so you have to work on it really hard to figure out how to do that. And Baruch Fishoff is sort of the father of decision science. He's at Carnegie Mellon University, and you might want to look at some of his work. But I'll also say that I'm right now working on a project to help Congress better value the behavioral and social sciences. And so we're building messages for Congress about that, and we've done some audience research up front. And it has a qualitative component and it has a quantitative component. And in the qualitative component, we found that people's perceptions of the behavioral and social sciences, and actually the sciences in general, is that it's fickle. And that, the example that we got from some of the interviews, I saw some of the videos of the interviews of people on the street, was that they tell me to drink coffee one day and the next day not to. But it's the same kind of fickleness, I think, and it's something to be really aware of. And as the scientific work gets translated over and over and over again, it loses some of that uncertainty, and it's difficult to do.
Going back to advocacy, in terms of avoiding advocacy, it also seems to me that it's not just merely avoiding advocating oneself, but also actively separating oneself from the advocate. Because a lot of times the sorts, whether it's climate change, whether it's evolution, whether it's any of those things, and on either side, the audience isn't just hearing what you're saying, they're hearing what you're saying in the context of what they associate to that. So I'm curious if you could touch a little bit on to what extent the individuals you mentioned advocating for not advocating, but to what extent they would also say to actively separate oneself from the advocacy, to make a point of saying, separate from what anyone's advocating on the basis of this is what I'm saying, completely separate from that.
And I have another program that's piloting in Pittsburgh right now. It's called the Science and Engineering Ambassadors Program, and it's designed to bring scientists and engineers into community decision making. And we do train those scientists. They get communication training, and then we facilitate ways in which they can interact with community decision makers and make Pittsburgh a better place. But at any rate, we do train them in that way, that if they find themselves in that kind of situation, to explain that they are the bearers of evidence. And in addition, scientists also are advocates. When they're standing up and speaking about it, they shouldn't be advocates. But even if they're if they're advocating for actions on climate change, they need to explain that this is not their scientific world. But it's really hard to do that. And it's hard for us to tell those scientists in Pittsburgh, you can't do that. They won't be an ambassador. I have 26 ambassadors in Pittsburgh. If they can't do what they want to do in their own community, it's a problem. But we do train them in ways that they can try to separate their advocacy from their evidence. Okay, we're ready to go? Okay. Thank you.